All right, we're going to get rolling.
They helped create an economy that was completely addicted to cheap money.
You need to buy savings bonds or something. You need to be way, way, way out of this space.
I subscribe to Miss Piggy's rule of money management. Always manage to have more money, you know what I mean?
It wasn't but 2 years ago that everybody was saying China's economy was going to be bigger than that of the United States. It's gone in the exact opposite direction.
So we're going to jump right in.
Welcome to This Week in Mining, where we talk about how to make money in the mining and the metals market. My name is Jay Martin, and my guest today is Alasdair McLeod. Alasdair, it's great to have you on the show. I'm looking forward to jamming with you this morning.
Thank you for having me on the show, Jay.
So there's a handful of different directions that I want to go with you today. Lots to discuss. I thought we'd begin with Ukraine because recently some comments that Senator Lindsey Graham made exposed maybe some of his true motivations or the U.S. true motivations behind supporting that war. Now, whenever a war breaks out, there's always like the headline narrative, which is, oppression and freedom and liberty and all this stuff. But there's always the implicit motivation, which is typically raw materials and natural resources. And Senator Graham's comments recently were more explicit about his desire for the $26 trillion of natural resources in the ground in Ukraine, 12 trillion of which are critical metals. So, I see things like this and I always kind of nod my head like, yeah, of course, there's always some bullet points or some threads like this that are getting pulled on. Give me your take right now, because before we hit record, you said, I think this situation is one that the public is grossly misunderstanding. So what's your take, and what are people misunderstanding or missing when it comes to the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, Jay, it's difficult to know whether, sort of the real motivation here. But just bear in mind that the attempt to get Ukraine into NATO, or at least into NATO's orbit, has been going on for a considerable time. I mean, we're going back to really the early 2000s, and particularly 2014, which led to Russia recovering Crimea. So, I mean, this has been a long running saga. There's nothing new in this. In terms of long-term motivation, I've heard that America in particular is interested in breaking up Russia and getting all its access to all its resources. So this is this resource story, I think, is something which may have something in it, but I think it's actually all got very, very lost in the politics of the situation. And we're now in a war against Russia. I mean, let's make no mistake about it. This proxy war actually is NATO versus Russia. And unfortunately for NATO, Russia is winning. I mean, I think the most recent invasion into Kursk, which seems to have been sanctioned by the Western powers, I mean, particularly America and the UK, and probably also with support of Poland, who's really sort of quite aggressive on this, and France maybe as well. I mean, it's the most stupid thing, because what it's done is it's divided Ukraine's forces. They had some, sort of crack regiments defending the situation in the east, the Donbass Oblast and all the rest of it. And they've had to split it. So now that the Russians, I mean, they see the gate is open and they're just sort of pushing forward. It's only a matter of time before, and I'm sure they're doing this already, they've got to consider how we can gracefully withdraw from this situation, if that is possible. Because this is, I mean, it's crazy. They're just killing Ukrainians, for why? For some sort of power play. And Senator Graham may well be right. It may be that they just want access to the resources and damn the people. I mean, this sort of attitude, we've seen before. So I certainly wouldn't rule it out, but I don't think there's any direct evidence that what he says is actually true.
When you say this sort of attitude is something we've seen before, can I get you to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, the one in particular, following 9/11, was the attack on Iraq, and that was followed by the deposal of Gaddafi in Libya, and then we had Syria, and we had Afghanistan. Now, all these, I'm sure, were noble interventions by America, supported by its allies, particularly Britain. But the result of that is the most appalling refugee crisis throughout Europe. You know, nobody actually sort of stood back and thought, well, what are the consequences of this policy? And so I can only assume that the American view is they just don't give a damn about what happens to the rest of us in Europe. Now, this is very, very worrying, because if I'm right in this, and the situation escalates against Russia to the point where there is maybe just limited use of nuclear weapons, I mean, we're cannon fodder here. You know, do we really want to be in that position? And the amazing thing is that the British government just sits there and says, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir, 3 bags full, anything you want, sir. We had Bill Burns over here with the head of MI6. Doing for the first time ever, I think, a joint press conference, agreeing entirely just, how wicked the Russians were and all the rest of it. I mean, there is no thought going into this, Jay, from our side at all. There is this belief, and it's really fed by propaganda more than facts, that Russia basically wants to take over Europe, and it won't stop, say, at the Ukraine. It will then gobble up, the Baltic states and then Latvia and all the rest of it. And somehow the Americans have persuaded the Swedes to end their long-standing neutrality. Now, this is something that wasn't even put to the people. And the Swedes, I know, are actually quite upset about this. This was just a diktat by the government. Right, we're joining NATO. That's it. So, Sweden was even independent in the last World War and the previous World War before that. It's been independent basically from the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And Finland, which got its independence from Russia in the wake of the last war, has also been independent for very, very good reasons. If you're independent, there's no point in someone coming and attacking you. It's only if you align with someone that you then become fair game. And, we live in a world, I'm afraid, Jay, where these decisions are irrational and they are extremely dangerous. About the only thing which, is so obvious, actually, is the Israeli situation, where Netanyahu just basically wants to drag America in to have a pop at the Iranians. And very sensibly, the Americans are sort of saying, well, we love you dearly, but, we're not necessarily going to do that. We'll do anything else we can to help, but we're not going to attack the Iranians, because apart from anything else, we all know that if they attack the Iranians, then the Straits of Hormuz would be blocked and oil would be, $200-300 a barrel. It's economic suicide, apart from anything else. But that's so obvious that even the deep state can see it in America, whereas it fails to see the course upon which it set itself, how dangerous that is against Russia. Putin is far smarter than anyone in Langley. It's just, he's proved it time and time again. And he's winning this war. Now, to my mind, the question is, how do we back out with keeping a little bit of, if you like, our pride intact? That's going to be a difficult one.
Right. Like the withdrawal in Afghanistan. That was relatively graceful.
This is a problem. Biden's presidency is, potentially bookended by 2 enormous disasters in foreign fields. I understand that the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan was actually taken by Trump in his final days. And it was Biden got lumbered with it. But it was so mishandled. We all remember seeing desperate people hanging on the undercraft of aircraft as they took off and then falling from 2,000 feet or whatever because they couldn't hold on any longer. It was appalling, the whole thing.
Yep.
And that's, if you like, further evidence that in my book, America actually doesn't really give a damn about lives outside America. Anything in America, yes, very, very concerned. Mm-hmm. And so I suspect that part of the end game for Russia, if we get more aggressive against Russia, will be to say to the Americans, look, if you're going to carry on down this line, then we will attack you from Siberia, because, I mean, America is within reach. Don't think that it'll just be confined to Europe.
Right.
But anyway, we'll see how it evolves.
When you step back and look at this situation, the two situations that you referenced, both the war in Europe and the war in the Middle East, and look at the bigger picture of American empire, Alasdair, and you look at the cycles of empire that we can study in sort of the recent 600 years, and you can see a very similar cycle on repeat, played again and again and again. And some of the key indicators that you see during the sunset years are massive currency devaluation, massive debt accumulation, deficits, and maybe in response to that, a surge in hot conflicts and hot wars, as I guess an animal with its back against the wall tends to become relatively unpredictable or becomes vulnerable to attack. How would you frame the stage of American empire today? If it was a baseball game, what inning are we in? Are we take it from there?
Yeah, it's obviously in decline, and what makes it worse for the Americans is that Russia and China have linked together. They are putting together a power base, which is the biggest that the world has ever seen. It will dwarf America. They already have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union. That was a guy called Sergei Glaziev was trying to put together a trade settlement currency for them, and BRICS, and they're queuing up to join BRICS. And this is an interesting one, because everybody who's thinking of getting involved in BRICS is equally frightened of what America would do, because America has this history of either calling in debts and creating a crisis or forcing regime change. I mean, the arrogance, if you like, in terms of colonialism or imperialism is probably the better word, is quite remarkable, and is backfiring the whole time. I mean, the sanctions against Russia, for example, where they literally made Russia's foreign reserves in dollars and also euros completely worthless. That sort of approach, it just allowed Putin to turn around and tell everybody in what is now being called the global south, look what these guys will do to you. And they all say, yeah, we know it. We know it. We don't want it anymore. So, America, by its actions, is actually destroying its own imperial power. And the interesting thing is that both Putin and Xi in China have just sort of let America tie itself in knots. I mean, why turn around and interfere with someone, who's basically destroying himself? That's where they are. That's what they see. And furthermore, the ultimate thing is that America has left itself wide open by trying to say that the dollar is money and gold is a pet rock or whatever, which is actually completely in contravention of common law around the world from Roman times. I mean, this is well established that gold is money and the rest is credit. And it's actually as simple as that. It's still true today, because for every dollar in issue, there is an entry, if you like, on the Fed's balance sheet as a liability. It is counterparty risk. And we have now America in a debt trap, quite simply, a debt trap from which they cannot escape. So, you've got this currency, the world reserve currency, which is based on the faith and credit of the US government. What's happening to that faith and credit in the US government? I mean, it's just going down the Swanee. So the whole situation is really working against America's imperialism, and they're desperately trying to hang on and to stop the rot, but they'll fail. I just hope that in their failure, they don't create too much unnecessary damage. But in a sense, that's what Ukraine is about.
Quick break here. This episode is brought to you by West Red Lake Gold Mines. Now, if you know nothing about West Red Lake Gold Mines, let me tell you one thing. This company was founded on the back of a transaction where they purchased the Madsen mine in northwestern Ontario in an area called the Red Lake Gold District, which to date has produced around 30 million ounces of gold from some of the richest gold deposits in the world. Now, what they paid for this mine versus what they got has led legendary mining entrepreneur Frank Giustra to call this transaction the deal of the decade. And Bob Moriarty, founder of 321 Gold, was recently on my show calling West Red Lake Gold Mines one of the two most undervalued gold companies in Canada. If you're curious why these individuals are so excited about West Red Lake Gold Mines, hit the link below to learn more. Now back to the episode. On the topic of de-dollarization, and maybe that's a good next subject to jump to. Yes, I look at the bridges being formed between China, Russia, and the global south, or you could say the global majority. I think it's 70% of the world's population are in these countries that you referenced. China's been very effective at building bridges all throughout the Muslim world and in now through South America. The west coast of South America just got their first deep water port. It wasn't American financed. It was Chinese financed, 50 miles north of Lima. Game changer for South American shipping routes. And these deals are being done all over the world. Infrastructure deals, usually in exchange for access to natural resources. There's always strings attached, but the point is you're getting deals done. You're getting bridges built, ports built, all of the stuff. What do you grab onto when it comes to the topic of de-dollarization, the conversation of de-dollarization, moving from a unipolar world to a multipolar world, whatever that might look like? What do you grab onto that's material, Alasdair, versus like probably just noise and not worth paying attention to?
Yeah, you're right. There's a lot of noise around it. One thing we do see is the People's Bank of China is selling dollars. People say that they're buying gold. No, they're not. They're selling dollars. I mean, you've got to get it the right way around. They're actually trying to reduce their dollars. So that is undoubtedly the first sign of this, if you like, the first real sign of it happening. But then we've got the BRICS summit in Kazan, I think it's called, in October, towards the end of October. And in that summit, there is said to be a debate about a new trade settlement currency. Everybody's got terribly excited because a couple of guys came up with this idea of a new currency called the unit, which is backed by blockchain and all the rest of it. Now, one of them is a Russian and the other is a Chinese guy. And you'd sort of think that, okay, there's a Russian and a Chinese expert. You know, they've been appointed by the government to look at this. No, they haven't. One's a fund manager for Arkhangelsk investments or something in Russia. And the other is a fund manager in the Far East. So, and computer expert. So, you know, he's got the blockchain, if you like it. I mean, it's not going to work. It's just absolutely crazy. And they quite clearly do not understand how credit works. I mean, money doesn't circulate. By money, I mean gold. It doesn't circulate. But the point about it is that you have a standard which guarantees the value of a currency, of the credit and all the dependent credit. That is how a proper gold standard works. This idea that you can put together 40% gold and a whole range of other currencies which are purely fiat but value the thing on a day-to-day sort of gold equivalent. I mean, it's just a complete bloody nonsense. It's as simple as that. So this is a debate which I think will be increasingly highlighted in the next couple of months ahead of the BRICS summit. Whether something actually appears on the summit about this or not, I really don't know. My take on it is it's actually extremely easy to introduce a gold-backed, let's say, a gold substitute currency for trade settlement purposes. You could do it tomorrow. It really is not difficult. I think more importantly, Russia would benefit hugely from going on to a gold standard. I mean, her economy would need very little adjustment because government spending isn't all that high. Okay, it's been increased because of the war against NATO in Ukraine, but it's still. I mean, their debt to GDP, in spite of all that spending, is still only 22%, and income tax in Russia, you're looking at a flat rate of 13 to 15%. What's not to like about that? Yet their interest rates, I mean, the reference rate for the Bank of Russia is 18%. The reason for this is that nobody has confidence in the currency. Who would want to buy rubles? Fiat rubles. I mean, I might like the numbers in the economy, but I don't think I'd want to buy fiat rubles. So you can see that the thing that is missing is the guarantee of the value of the ruble. If you can do that, then interest rates will decline, and you have an economy which doesn't demand great consumer spending being financed by bank credit or whatever. It's basically an economy which can grow on production, and it's got all the characteristics of a really good 19th century economy. So that's the way they should go. And I think if Russia does it, then you'll find that the Saudis will do it quite quickly. Because they're in a similar situation. I mean, they're selling oil for all these rubbish currencies. Do they really want them? No. I mean, they're being very polite about it, as everybody is, but nobody wants, sort of Egyptian pounds or Iranian rials or Pakistani rupees, Indian rupees. They're all rubbish. And rupiahs from Indonesia. I mean, these are not good currencies. And, once you've got them, what do you do with them? There's nothing you can do with them. So a gold standard, I think, is actually the answer, a proper gold standard. And the merit of it is that you could introduce a gold standard without having to have the agreement, unanimous agreement of the BRICS members. You just say to them, look, the facility is here if you want it. You don't have to agree to it. If you don't want it, don't take it. It's very simple. So why aren't they doing it? The reason they're not doing it, Jay, is that the moment they go on to a gold standard, a credible gold standard, they will destroy the fiat currency world, including, guess what, the dollar. And I don't think the Chinese in particular want to be associated with a deliberate act that destroys the dollar. They would rather protect themselves from a collapse in the dollar by whatever means, which obviously will involve going on to some sort of gold standard. But once it is completely obvious that they've got to protect themselves and it's not their fault. So we're at this transition, and I think it's very important to understand this. Part of what you're talking about, the demise of the American hegemony power, is the currency. The currency is going to collapse because of the debt crisis. And I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, we'll almost certainly get a crisis in terms of the valuation of financial assets, because if you're going to get a collapsing dollar, then you're going to get rising interest rates. I mean, I know that they're talking about interest rates falling and all the rest of it, but that is not going to be a long-lasting thing. They are going to fall very slightly, perhaps because the political landscape demands it. And the Fed is under enormous pressure. When you see signs of a recession arriving, what do? You reduce interest rates. But in fact, inflation isn't going away. It'll be coming back. The purchasing power of the dollar will decline. Interest rates will have to rise. And then what happens? I mean, you can see the whole thing beginning to fall apart. I don't think we've got very long before that happens. So these are difficult times. They really are, particularly for America and also Britain.
Yeah. Okay. So interesting take on, there's no shortage of pundits talking about the central bank gold buying trends, which honestly, and obviously I follow that very closely. We're setting 40, 50-year records, averaging like 1,200 tons per annum now. It's a lot. There's a bit of comedy in the fact that gold bugs will spend decades criticizing central banks. And then as soon as the central banks start buying gold, they celebrate the acumen of the central banks. Like, look, this is the indicator we've been waiting for. I'd love to get your thoughts on that maybe in a minute. But so Project Enbridge is the initiative that you don't put a lot of weight on. This is the potential new rails for a non-SWIFT financial system backed by Russia, China, supported by BRICS, correct?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I had a brief look at it, and I thought this is, sort of mainly hot air. I mean, the Enbridge idea, I think, started with the Bank of International Settlements. I don't see it's necessary. There is this tendency to think we live in a technocratic age, and so there's a technocratic solution to everything. Really? Mm-hmm. It just complicates things. I mean, what you want out of a medium of, settlement medium, credit, money, whatever, you want something which is absolutely clear and very simple and ordinary people can respect. You start doing things like, CBDCs and Enbridge and all the rest of it, you're going to lose everybody, really. It doesn't make much sense to me. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't rule out the possibility that they'll go down that route because it is extremely fashionable. But I think it would be a bit stupid when actually there's a very simple solution staring them in the face. Introduce a proper gold standard so that their currencies become gold substitutes. And funnily enough, I'm actually writing about it on my Substack, which will be published. This will be published on Thursday. And I lay out exactly how to do this. It's not difficult. It really isn't. And we've got lessons we've learned from the past. I mean, particularly the failings of the Bank Charter Act of 1844 in the UK, which sort of set the scene forevermore. There were definite failings in there. So, we've learned by experience. So what we could do today is actually a far better thing and is likely to be lasting, long lasting. The problem, Jay, is that governments don't like firm currencies for the very simple reason they want to use the seigniorage. They want to expand it. They want to finance things by inflationary means. So that is a real problem. And I don't see the Western governments coming off that desire, the policy, at all. I mean, it would take a real crisis and maybe following on crises in the plural in order to convince their electorates that that stability in the currency would be a good thing. But we're nowhere near that in the West. I mean, they're a lot closer to it in the East because they haven't had, 60, 70, 80 years of Keynesian and, Keynesian rubbish economics.
Yeah.
So I mean, they're being given the Keynesian stuff. That is absolutely for sure. And some of them are beginning to fall for it. But I don't think it's nearly as ingrained as it is in the West. I mean, no. It's from my point of view, it's actually very, very simple. I think that we will actually end up being saved by the Russia-China access if they do go on to a proper gold standard. And I think they will, apart from anything else. China's plans, which Russia is very much involved with, is to have an industrial revolution throughout Asia, the industrial revolution which basically escaped them in the 19th century when Europe was really going gangbusters on technology, innovation, new products, lifting people from a subsistence living to relative comfort. I mean, we've spoiled ourselves. We've moved on, if you like, from that, and we just all want to put our feet up and not do any work. Whereas the Chinese and the Russians and all the rest of them are actually extremely enthusiastic about an industrial revolution, and they will bring it about. You can be sure.
Well, that's interesting because the biggest challenge that people point to with China and Russia is the demographic issue. We're facing that here as well. Every advanced country has a massive demographic crisis coming down the pipeline, and we're at different stages down that path. Not as far in North America as they are in China, Russia, but China's solution to that seems to be co-opting the most favorable demographic countries through this second industrial revolution by co-opting the global south, countries like India, Africa, fantastic demographics relative to what you might call the developed world. you mentioned the probability of some kind of more pure gold standard coming out of the East. And if there's evidence for that, I mean, there's probably a few pieces, but one of them would be just the gross accumulation of gold in China. They're importing mass amounts of gold. They're also the world's largest gold producer, and they export none of it. So we don't really know, do we, much about China's gold stores. Is that correct?
Not officially, no.
Okay. Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, I say that as far as gold is concerned, China is like a Hotel California. Once it goes in, you don't see it again.
Right.
I mean, I did an exercise trying to work out how much gold the Chinese had before 2002, when they then set up the Shanghai Gold Exchange and permitted their citizens to buy gold. In fact, they advertised and said, gold is good for you, or whatever the byline was. And the result is that since 2002, the citizens have acquired something like 27,000 tons delivered through the SGE. Now, that's a gross figure, because what I haven't seen is details, if you like, of scrap going back into the SGE's vaulting system. But I think, we're probably looking well over 25,000 tons, I should say, are in private sector hands. Now, the reason that they started to permit the public, if you like, the Chinese citizens to buy gold in 2002 was it was quite clear that the state had acquired enough of a stake for it to be satisfied, and therefore not to be acting in competition with its own citizens in acquiring gold. And you need to go back to 1983, when the regulations were put in place for the People's Bank of China, was appointed then to acquire the nation's gold and manage the nation's gold reserves, and also silver. And that was 1983. Now, bearing in mind that from that time going on to 2002, there was a massive bear market in gold, which took it down from, we're talking about something like $600. It had been higher in 1981, but something like $600, $500 down to half that. A lot of gold was sold out from the West. And not only that, but there was a lot of gold leasing going on, where gold was disappearing into the market and not going back into central banks' coffers. This was estimated by Frank Veneroso in 2002 to have totaled somewhere between 10 and 16,000 tons. Now, he said at the time that he thought that this had ended up round the necks adorning Asian women. Some of it, I'm sure, did, but I think the bulk of it actually went into China. I reckon that by 2002, she had acquired between 20 and 25,000 tons of gold. Now, bearing in mind that ever since then, the policy has continued of not allowing any gold to go out of China. In 2014, I interviewed a director of one of the Swiss refiners, and I asked him whether he'd ever seen any Chinese refined bars, and he said no. I asked him the same question about 7 years later, and he said, well, I heard reports of a few, but we guess they were smuggled out. So you can see that nothing comes out of China. And as you rightly point out, they've accelerated their mine production. They import doré from elsewhere, particularly silver, and refine it. It doesn't go out. The only part of China where there is any sort of free trade in gold is Hong Kong. But an awful lot of that, some of the gold from Hong Kong, I think, is released from China. But basically, that is more or less matched by the people on a day trip to Hong Kong, walking into the shops in Hong Kong and buying gold jewelry. And they take it back, having saved sales tax of something like 20%. So China has accumulated a hell of a lot of gold. Now, how much she's got since 2002 as a nation, I honestly don't know. But I think we could probably, from her mines and various other sources, we could probably say that it's there's another, possibly 10,000 tons. So what we're looking at in China is we're looking at probably 30 to 35,000 tons in the hands of the government, the Communist Party, if you were, hidden around various accounts like the People's Liberation Army and the youth wing of the Communist Party and all this sort of stuff, not shown as reserves on the People's Bank's balance sheet. And the other thing, which is a more recent event, is that banks have been instructed to offer gold accounts to their customers. And what this means is that if you've got a bank account with, one of the main Chinese banks, then you can equally deposit your yuan into a gold account. And then you have got an account which tracks the price of gold. Now, bearing in mind that China is a high savings-driven nation, they reckon that household savings amount to 35% of GDP. Now, that is the equivalent of $6 trillion. Property is not absorbing any of this anymore. They can't go and buy foreign investments because of exchange controls. The stock market has been pretty poor for the last 3 years, in contrast to what's been going on in the West. I mean, it's picked up this year a bit, sure, but not enough to persuade Mrs. Wong or whatever the housewife may be called to go and buy stocks. But her bank offers a gold account. And so the bank then has to go out and buy gold. And I think this is what we're seeing at the moment in the gold markets. We're seeing the stands for delivery on COMEX alone have been over 2,000 tons since 2021. I mean, it's a fantastic number. On top of that, you've got deliveries out of London. So, any spare gold is basically being siphoned off to the east. And of course, it's not just, the Chinese housewife bank account, bank therefore in the market, but it's also India. And they've recently removed, now you may ask why, but they've recently removed the tax or cut the tax on gold down to something like 5%. Why? India started buying gold too after a long period of not doing anything at all. Why? Because she knows that the way the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is going and BRICS, gold is going to be the future. The days of fiat currencies are rapidly drawing to a close, so she's got to have gold. She's very Keynesian in her approach, but even she sees, it would be a bit silly for us not to have any gold under these circumstances. So this is something that I think, Jay, is going to continue until the system breaks. When we see gold being just incredibly stable at $2,500, I mean, that just tells me that there's big money in there buying the dips, and it never goes further than maybe $10, $20 below the 2,500 level. Right. There is a big buyer in there. And my guess is it's probably China's got something to do with it. If not China, then her associates, the central banks, whatever, around the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS.
Interesting. I as you're explaining this, I find myself thinking about recent Chinese history and lessons learned. For example, it's shocking to me how many people in the West aren't really familiar with the Opium Wars in China, for example. Yep. I imagine in Britain it's different, but in North America,
it's no different.
It's no different.
And worse than that, we now have a woke sort of woke thing changing history.
Well,
we haven't done it for the Chinese because we still don't like the Chinese. But the moment we love the Chinese, I can tell you they'll rewrite the history books on the Opium Wars.
All right. Okay. So really monumental turning point in history. I mean, this is sort of what established European dominance to a degree. But anyways, the point is it's a key ingredient in Chinese academics through elementary and high school. They're very familiar, right? So what does that mean? Well, it just means that prior to the Opium Wars, and one of the reasons for the Opium Wars was that, as you just mentioned, gold's going into China, it's not coming out. Well, China back then in the 18th and early 19th century was known as the place where silver goes to die, right?
Absolutely.
Silver went in,
Yeah.
it never went out, right?
Sure.
And to finance the tea trade, right? This led to the Opium Wars and this triangular trade, tea for silver, silver for opium, opium for silver, silver for tea, right? And that mentality, I mean, it's going to carry through that's recent history in China. It's a very hard lesson that led to the century of humiliation in that country. And this is taught all through the school system. So they're very familiar with it. So to grab on to the financial philosophy that preceded that maintained China's strength, when they abandoned it, they became weak. I mean, that's a very visceral and near-term lesson that I imagine is instilled in the population. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. I must admit, I hadn't thought about it, but what you say makes enormous sense. I mean, the Chinese have an enormous, if you like, knowledge of their own history and their own culture. I can't remember where it was. I went somewhere where there's, I think it was in the Caribbean. Was it in the Caribbean? I can't remember. Greece. I know it was in Greece somewhere, where the Chinese embassy had granted a gift to this particular town. I think it was Zante or something like that. And this was a sort of a statue of a sitting Confucius. This is a message. I mean, absolutely. So as to the point you make about, okay, it was silver in the Opium Wars. Now it's gold. I think you're dead right. But this time, I don't think the Chinese will be playing it in quite the same way they played it then. So they will have learned. We haven't. We've forgotten. You make a very interesting point, which hadn't occurred to me. But good one.
And it's a different China today, right? From a technological advancement standpoint.
Yeah. I mean, they're way ahead of us. They're way ahead of us. I mean, just look at what these electric car. The EVs, electric vehicle thing. I mean, both America and Europe are, talking about or have already put in 100% tariffs because it'll wipe out their own motor manufacturing capability. Right. They say that the Chinese are subsidizing these companies and all the rest of it. I mean, I don't know. Very often this sort of thing is actually made up rubbish. But the fact of the matter is that in China, they are ahead of us in technology, and that's our fault. I mean, Trump turned around and said, right, we're going to isolate you from American technology. So what do? They invented it for themselves. They're way ahead of us technologically wise. I mean, they're lucky in the sense that they've had almost a sort of blank sheet of paper to start on, whereas, you want to build a factory here. I mean, unless you're prepared to argue, about planning and all permission, all this, and government permissions, for literally a decade, forget it. You can go and build a factory in China or Southeast Asia in 18 months and have the thing actually producing. And this, in terms of cost of capital, is vitally important. We've lost our ability to compete with Southeast Asia and China in particular. It's as simple as that.
And so when that occurs, you see tantrums being thrown like the tariffs. I'd love maybe to get your thoughts on the Trump tariffs, because from my perspective, it probably had zero to negative economic impact. It might have scored some local political points, and maybe that was the point. I don't know. But what's your take, Alasdair, on the Trump tariffs? And do you expect, in the event of a second term for President Trump, that we see a resurgence?
Yeah, well, I've seen people spinning it differently, but make no mistake, tariffs are a tax on your own people. It's actually as simple as that. Now, what it'll do is it'll put up prices. That wouldn't matter if it wasn't for the fact that the way in which the government and the Fed operate is that, if you want to buy this, then they'll provide the credit for you to do it one way or the other, because if they deny you the credit, the economy goes down and all this sort of stuff. They will finance it. So the result is that, prices rise. And if the general level of prices is rising, then basically, you put it another way, the purchasing power of your currency is falling. And so on that basis, there is an inflationary push, if you like, from tariffs nowadays. It's very, very different, perhaps, from when the Fordney-McCumber Act came in, I think it was 1921. In those days, they didn't just print money in order to finance consumption, stimulate demand. That really came with FDR, which actually just screwed things hugely. I mean, we all like the idea of the New Deal and all the rest of it, but that's Keynesian stuff. I mean, and complete nonsense. The other thing about it is that there is a twin deficit syndrome. Now, what this means is, if you sort of follow through the national accounts, if the government is running a budget deficit, then this inevitably feeds through into a trade deficit. Now, the swing factor in this is savings. If people increase their savings, then that decreases the trade deficit relative to the budget deficit. But that's not what we're seeing at the moment. What we're seeing at the moment is savings are being completely destroyed in America. I mean, they've gone negative. So, we're looking this year, I guess, in the year ending at the end of this month, we've probably got a budget deficit of what? I mean, realistically, it's probably 2.4 to 2.5 trillion, something like that.
Yeah.
That gets reflected pretty much in the budget deficit. Put in the downturn in savings, and it's going to be at least as bad. So, if that's the source of your trade deficit, then putting in tariffs is not going to change anything. It really isn't. I mean, if you're selective against China, then the imports will come from somewhere else. Or the other thing that happens is that you may not import goods, but you might import services, in the form of tourism, whatever. So, one way or the other, it's actually a catastrophic policy. It's not going to do anything. It is protectionist against for US industry, which basically means that US industry will become less and less competitive on the world stage. And that doesn't do anyone any good at all.
Right.
So in summary, I don't think these tariffs are a very good idea.
Yeah, right. The motivation, Alasdair, is strictly political. Is that, do you think that's behind? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's, the politicians will look at first cause.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is, Kamala Harris was saying that she's going to stop price gouging and all the rest of it. The reason that prices are rising is because they're diluting the purchasing power of the currency. And that's even before the foreigners have decided that, this is a thing that they don't want to hold. So that is why prices are rising. It's not because, your supermarket or your, clothing shop or whatever, are price gouging. Not at all. I mean, assuming there is reasonable competition, which there always is, what we're seeing price pressures on those businesses. It's not price gouging at all. But what does the politician do? He blames the businesses. He says they're profiteering. Yeah. And this is something politicians have been doing since Roman times. I mean, admittedly, not with paper money, but in those days with clipping coinage or debasing the coinage or whatever. Diocletian was the first. Well, I mean, he wasn't the first emperor to do it. Nero was the first one to do it, but it all fell apart under Diocletian and Diocletian produced this edict of prices written in stone. These are the maximum prices. Mm-hmm. And if, let us say, a butcher sold, beef, or meat, whatever, at a higher price, then, he was taken out into the public square and hanged by the neck until dead or whatever. I mean, these weren't sort of like penalties. The result was everybody left Rome. It did more to destroy the economy of Rome than anything else. And of course, we're going to see it again. I mean, Nixon did it. So why not Kamala Harris if she gets in? Why not Trump, perhaps? I don't know.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest threats I see to the West right now is, public sector officials swinging into the private market, telling everybody we'll regulate this back to productivity, right? And it's the same as like trying to land an airplane with a sledgehammer. They don't know what they're swinging at. It's just, big statements, big moves, big headlines, zero understanding of second and third order implications. This is the Gulch story. Like we know this, right? What occurs here. But in a rising populism environment where we have a popularity contest every 2 years in the US to, elect our leaders, it's like, what do you expect them to say? It's almost like you can't even point the finger because that's what the system incentivizes. It incentivizes short-term false promises. I mean, directly.
Yeah, absolutely.
So why would we get anything different, right?
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, two phrases which really spring to mind, which I love. As Ronald Reagan said, the one thing you don't want to hear when someone knocks on your door is, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help," which I thought was splendid. And the other one was Milton Friedman, who said, if the government was in charge of the Sahara, there'd be a shortage of sand. He's dead right. Look at Venezuela. Venezuela's got just about the largest oil reserves in the world.
Yeah.
And they're bust.
Yes.
Dear, oh dear.
I love that Friedman quote. I'd forgotten about that. That's a great one. Yeah. Alasdair, where can I send people? You've got a Substack, Gold Money, obviously, but where should I send people today if they want to hear more from you?
Well, it's my Substack is alasdairmcleod.substack.com. I mean, Google it, or McLeod Finance is the other one, so that might make it slightly easier. People in Canada know how to spell McLeod, I think, more than elsewhere. But
right.
The objective of my Substack is to try and educate people about these enormous dangers which we now face, and hopefully encourage them to prepare themselves so that they're not caught by complete disaster. So, and things are getting bad quite rapidly. It's people ask me, what's going to fall apart first. I mean, it's a pretty nasty race to the bottom. But I think it's desperately important that ordinary people actually do understand this. We cut through the propaganda of the Keynesians, of the macroeconomists and government, and actually have a proper perspective on the financial and economic dangers that face us and how to protect yourself from them. So that's the objective of my Substack.
Okay. I will put links beneath this video for anybody. And how often do you publish, Alasdair?
Well, I write basically, I do a market report on Friday, which sort of sums up the week's events. And I try and introduce aspects into that report which are probably not covered in other market reports, sort of the international scene a bit more and so on. And the other thing is I do write a more serious piece once a week, which comes out on Thursdays. And as I said earlier, this one is about how Russia and BRICS could actually introduce a gold standard, and why the unit proposition, which everybody's been talking about, is actually A, a non-starter, and B, I don't think has got any credence really, within the government circles who are actually have to take the decision.
I'm looking forward to reading that one. Depending on when you're watching this, guys, Alasdair is referring to Thursday, September 12th. That's when this piece will be published. And very timely. I'm looking forward to reading it. So thank you for that.
Good. Well,
and thank you for coming on the show today. It was great. Really great chatting with you.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
All right.